I'm Dan Gardner. Now, you are all connoisseurs of big projects, so that probably means that you know my co-author, the Oxford University professor, Bent Fluebjerg. And you probably also know Bent's database. Bent has the world's largest database of big projects. And you probably also know that that database has something to say about the quality of how we deliver big projects, and it's not good. Plot spoiler. Here are three key pieces of data. First, what percentage of big projects comes in on budget? Anybody? Survey says 47.9%. Kind of the definition of mediocrity. What percentage of big projects comes in on budget and on time? 8.5%. But of course, we don't just do big projects in order to deliver them on budget and on time. We do big projects to get the benefits of the project. You know, that's the profits, that's the people moved, that's the tourists attracted, or whatever. So what percentage of big projects comes in on budget, on time, and delivers the benefits it promised? 0.5%, a rounding error. I think we can all agree that that's not acceptable, okay? So how do we do better? Now, the full answer to how do we do better will, of course, take hours or days. I have 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you the 10-minute version, and I'm going to hit on three key points, and I'm going to draw them out of a project you will probably be familiar with. I'm sure most of you know this. This is the Guggenheim Art Museum in Bilbao, Spain. It was designed by the Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry, the legendary Frank Gehry. This project, when it opened in 1997, it was 3% under budget. It was on time, and not only did it deliver the benefits it promised, it actually massively exceeded the benefits. So this was a spectacular success, such a success that it made Frank Gehry the global rock star he became. So how was that possible? Well, the first of the three answers to that question I can show you with a photograph of Frank Gehry at the time that he was designing the Bilbao Guggenheim. That's him. When I look at that photograph, the first word that comes to mind is rumpled. Frank Gehry looks like he's been around the block half a dozen times. In fact, at that time, even though this was the project that made him a star, he had already been a working architect for 4 decades. And that fact goes a long way to explaining why this was such a successful project. Experience matters. Experience matters to big projects in 1,000 different ways. Now, you may be saying, isn't that kind of obvious? Don't we all know that? And you're right, it is obvious. I shouldn't have to say that. But I do have to say it because big projects routinely shortchange experience. Why does that happen? There's a long list of reasons, but the most common reason is politics. And you can see that in one of the worst fiascos in modern project history, California high-speed rail. In all of the United States, there is no high-speed rail, which tells you how much experience American engineers have with high-speed rail. So when California announced it was going to build a high-speed rail link between Los Angeles and San Francisco, the French company SNCF did a very smart thing. They opened an office in San Francisco, and they put up their hand and said, hey, California, we have 60 years of experience designing, building, and operating high-speed rail. Hire us in some capacity. But California didn't. For reasons of domestic politics, California failed to develop a relationship, a partnership with SNCF. And so SNCF said, okay, they closed the office, packed their bags, and went home. And now, and now that project has been underway for 10 years. They have spent something like $17 billion, and it hasn't moved a single passenger, not one. And it's almost certain that, in fact, this project will never be completed. Experience matters. Now, on the flip side, by coincidence, At the same time that California was saying, hey, let's build America's first high-speed rail, Morocco said, let's build high-speed rail. There was no high-speed rail in Africa. So clearly, Morocco, they did not have any experience with this. But what did Morocco do? Morocco went to SNCF, the French company, and they formed a partnership, a very effective partnership. And they built that rail line in 7 years. It opened in 2018, and it's been operating smoothly since. Experience really, really matters. Now, experience isn't all that matters, of course, particularly when you're doing something as daring and bold and innovative as the Bilbao Guggenheim. By definition, when you're innovating, you're doing something that hasn't been done before. So how then do you compensate for the obvious loss of experience? Frank Gehry understood that problem, and he came up with an ingenious solution. You know what he did? He started to design the Bilbao Guggenheim, and he started to do it the old-fashioned way. Some paper, some sketches, and he'd have some ideas, and he would talk to his people, and he would talk to engineers, and he would talk to the client and work through the problems. And then he would start with crude models. And he continued iterating with the crude models. And then he went to more sophisticated models, and he would iterate. Now, everything that I've just said, architects have been doing that since the pyramids. But Frank Gehry, remember this is the mid-1990s, then did something that nobody else had ever done before. Frank Gehry looked at his design and he said, it's all curves. And Frank Gehry knew from experience, there's that word again, that it's very hard to translate curves from paper to buildings. And so Gehry said, how can I design in a reliable way? How can I design curves in a reliable way? Who does this with precision and reliability? And he had an ingenious idea. He said, the aerospace companies. Aerospace companies design with amazing precision. They have to. The jets wouldn't fly otherwise. And guess what? Those jets, curves everywhere. So Frank Gehry went to the French company Dassault, and he licensed their software for use in architecture. And then he translated his design into this digital simulation, and he continued iterating. What if we did this? What if we did that? What are the implications for the aesthetics of the building, for the structural integrity, for the plumbing, for the wiring? All the 10,000 questions. And he iterated to exhaustion. And only when he and his team were absolutely convinced that they had a truly rigorous, tested plan, did delivery begin. Simulation and iteration is absolutely essential. Now, the really wonderful thing about this is that the technology that's available to us now for simulation, it's magical compared to what Frank Gehry had 30 years ago. It's amazing what we can do with simulations. But here's the critical thing to remember. As important as the technology is, far more important is how you use it. Are you pushing it? Are you really demanding a rigorous test? In our book, we talk about the Pixar, the animation company. Pixar is a very sophisticated company. They have very advanced computers. But they have a simulation and iteration process that can only be described as low-tech or even crude. But it works. And why does it work? Because the directors and animators at Pixar push. And again, only when they're absolutely convinced that they have tested everything that can be tested do they greenlight the project and bring it into delivery. Now, next item, the last item, after experience and after simulation and iteration. This factor comes in at the beginning of the project. And it's one, in fact, if I had to choose one, I would say it's the most commonly overlooked factor. And I think, personally, it's the most important factor of them all. And I can illustrate by this project. Where did this project come from? Spanish officials in the early 1990s came to Frank Gehry, and they had a very clear idea of what they wanted to do with their project. And the clear idea that they had looked absolutely nothing like what you're seeing here. Nothing. In fact, the Spanish officials came to Frank Gehry and they said, there is an old building in Bilbao. We would like you to renovate it to make it a suitable home for a Guggenheim Art Museum. Now, most people would just say either yes or no. Yes, that interests me, I'll take the commission, or no, no thanks, pass. Frank Gehry isn't most people. Frank Gehry starts every project the same way. He asks, why? Why are you doing this project? What do you hope to achieve with this project? Well, he started a conversation. And in that conversation, Gehry learned that Bilbao is an old Spanish industrial city, and the industry is gone. This town is economically depressed. Now, Spain, of course, has a huge tourism industry, but the tourists only go to southern Spain or Madrid. They don't go to northern Spain, which is where Bilbao is. So these officials had this idea. They said, if we have a Guggenheim Art Museum, we'll get the tourists that will come here and they will revive our economy. Simple, right? Makes sense. But Gehry thought about it carefully and he said, you know what? I don't think that can work. For them to want to go to Bilbao to see the Guggenheim Art Museum, they have to know that there's a Guggenheim Art Museum in Bilbao. For that to happen, you have to get global media attention. How do you get global media attention for a building renovation? And he said, the way you've designed this project won't work. But I have a better idea. Down at the bend in the river, there's an old factory. Knock that factory down. I will build a building, design a building for you, the likes of which nobody's ever seen before. That will get global media attention, that will raise global awareness, and that will get you your tourists. And that is exactly what happened. That is what made this project the smashing success it was. And it wouldn't have happened if the project hadn't started with why. So, experience, simulate, iterate, why. That is how big things get done, or at least the 10-minute version. Thanks very much.